For the extra practice on finding percent of a number, I just want to break down a few of those simple problems we started with right away, showing both of the algorithms again and making sure we understand both principles. So for our first problem, we have 30% of 28. Once again, there are two ways to solve. The first way that I personally use all the time, if possible, is patterns or fractions. Now, patterns or fractions work really nicely if this comes from one of the fraction or percentages on our list that we've memorized. Well, we know that 30% is 3 times bigger than 10%. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do 10% of 28, and then I'm going to use that information to find 30% of 28. Well, dividing this number by 10 simply puts a decimal point in between the 2 and the 8, because 2 and 8 tenths times 10 is 28. 30% then just has to simply be 3 times bigger than our 2 and 8 tenths. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do 2 and 8 tenths times 3, and I'm going to remember that we had one digit behind the decimal point. It's equal to 24. 2 times 3 is 6, plus an extra 2 is 8. So this should be 8 and 4 tenths for our answer. And that's using fractions or patterns to find percentages. The other way is called the standard algorithm. This is the one that most people will use. It's easy to remember, but there is a lot of math that goes on with using the standard algorithm. It gets a little heavy, so we have to make sure we don't use it for every single problem. We turn 30% into the decimal 3 tenths or 30 hundredths, and then we simply multiply. And if you notice in this problem, we actually got to the same point with the standard algorithm both ways. And that will happen a lot, because the truth is the standard algorithm comes from using the fractions above. It just is sometimes hard to recognize them as you're working through the problem. But those are the two methods for solving these problems. Both are effective, and I would make sure that you use both of them depending on the type of problem you're working with, because one is going to be drastically easier than the other depending on the problem. Now for this one, we're working in reverse again. So we're looking for a percent. What percent of 240 is 48? So once again, I like to write this the other way. 48 is some percent of 240. And I write it this way because it's reasonable to me to look at this problem and know, okay, that this has to be less than 100%, because 100% would be equal to 240. Therefore, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up the fraction 48 over 240, and then I am going to simplify this fraction and turn it into a percentage. Both of these numbers are divisible by 2, so I'm going to start there. If you're ever unsure of what numbers to divide first with fractions, 2 is an excellent starting point. Now, once again, still divisible by 2, so I'm going to do that. If you're recognizing that there are other numbers that are more easily divisible here, that's great. In fact, I remember from my multiplication chart that 60 is 12 times 5. So I can actually skip a step and get down here to 1/5. Now, from 1/5, we have two ways to turn this into a percentage. The first way is long division. This is not the fastest strategy, but it definitely works. There is a 0 here, which means I go to the 10. That's going to be 2. And actually, remainders are 0, so we got really lucky here. Hundredth is the same as percent per hundredth. So we put our digit right there, and we get an answer of 20%. So long division actually wasn't too bad for this problem. The other way to find the percentage is we need to turn this into tenths, hundredths, or thousandths. And for this problem, 1/5 is equal to 2/10, and 2/10 is equal to 20 hundredths, which is the same as 20%. Doing one more problem like that can give us a few more unusual answers. And it's important to understand that you need to be very careful with your fractions to make sure you get them correct. So 36 is what percent of 250? Now this one is actually written in the way that I normally write it, which means that our answer has to be less than 100% again. Therefore, I'm going to do 36 divided by 250. Now, to find a number that's divisible for both of these, I'm going to start with 2 because they're even, and actually off the top of my head, I struggle to find a better digit than 2. And I am getting 1,825. Now, from this point, you have a few options, but personally, I would say this type of problem, you can use a calculator to solve. And I say that because, first of all, we can't simplify this fraction any further. Obviously, there probably is a simplified fraction here. But the other thing is, if we did long division, we would get a 3-digit divisor. And one of my rules is you can use a calculator when I use a calculator in the video, which is what I'm doing right now. And I get this decimal. And that decimal tells me right away that using a calculator was the right strategy here. So I get 144 thousandths. Now we know percent means per 100. So that means our percent is going to go right there in between those digits. Now we don't have to round here. So I'm going to say our answer is 14 4/10%. And that's about as tough as these problems get. The strategy is always going to be the same. If you get to somewhere where you have a 3-digit divisor, by all means, use a calculator, but turn it into a ratio, turn that ratio into a percentage. Now, finally, the last problem, something that's near and dear to my heart, is last season, the Golden State Warriors had 3 great three-point shooters. And here was their statistics they had throughout the season. And my question is, which of these shooters is best by percent? So we need to turn each of these 3 things into a percentage and then solve. And I'm going to show you this problem specifically because when you're dealing with real-world problems, the numbers are not going to be very clean. And so it's important to know when it's appropriate to use a calculator. Now, I could simplify these fractions down, and I think that would probably be possible, but this is also the situation where you can use a calculator. As soon as you have 3 digits in the numerator and denominator, even before you've simplified, is also a good time to use a calculator, which is what I'm doing right now. So Steph Curry, and here's another thing about this problem. These are not exact. So I'm going to put these signs here that means about equal to. I'm going to put Steph Curry's percent right there. Klay Thompson, his percent is also not exact. And then finally Kevin Durant, and his percent also not exact, which happens in math problems all the time. You do not deal with exact numbers very often. Now, once on all of these, I'm going to make sure I put my decimal behind the hundreds place, which means I get 46, and 42 hundredths percent. Man, that was ugly. Let's try that again. 46 and 42 hundredths percent. I got 42 and 46 hundredths percent. And finally for Kevin, I got 38 and 67/100%. All of these are incredibly high numbers, but it turns out Steph Curry actually had one of the best seasons in NBA history with these. And that is exactly when you would be using percentages. As always, if you have any questions, please let me know. If there's anything in the video you didn't understand, we can work through it together.